as we head into tomorrow's Pokemon Presents and finally see the first proper gameplay trailer for Pokemon Legends EA, it has me reflecting on how Pokemon as a series was handled on Nintendo Switch. For many, it has been a very divisive era for the series, and that's not necessarily a controversial thing to think, as it has been very rough and very rocky, but also I'd argue quite experimental. And so I thought today I would go into all of the ups and downs of Pokemon on Nintendo Switch and really determine, is Pokemon safe? Is it in good hands? And will Nintendo Switch 2 bring good for Pokemon as a series? But before we get into it, I just wanted to reintroduce myself. Obviously, my name is Obster. Well, my actual name is Luca, and I really do appreciate the support for this channel so far. It is quite new, and I'm really happy with how it's been naturally growing. However, if you don't currently, I would really appreciate if you would subscribe to the channel, just to keep the growth at a steady pace. And I would really love to hear from you, that if you're listening to this, any personal thoughts on this topic, and maybe any feedback for future videos, maybe some suggestions for what I can talk about in the future. But anyway, I will stop bothering you and enjoy the video. In 2017, Ishihara at E3 2017 announced officially that they were working on a mainline entry into the Pokemon series, and that came after quite a ride, really, because Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon had been announced about maybe a week before E3, and the expectations before that was announced was that Alola would be brought to the Nintendo Switch. There were a lot of rumors when it came to Pokemon Stars, and the expectation for Pokemon to be on the Switch, since it was a hybrid console, was very palpable. As there was a lot of excitement for seeing Pokemon on a home console, which was something that we'd never seen before. The closest we had before was obviously Pokemon XD and Pokemon Colosseum and those kind of games, but like a proper new generation was something very novel, and the expectations were already very highly built up. And so when we finally got that official acknowledgement from GameFreak at E3, it was quite surprising, but it was very exciting, and the expectations were already mounting up. I remember at the time there were interviews with Game Informer that seemed to imply that they were listening to fan demands, and they were trying to be ambitious. And at the time, the Breath of the Wild hype was at an all-time high, and I think a lot of people were really hoping that Pokemon would go full Breath of the Wild open world. That was the caliber of excitement at the time in 2017. So heading into 2018, I don't remember if the expectation was that Gen 8 would come out that year, or if maybe we'd get Pokemon Gen 4 remakes or something like that. However, I don't think anyone expected for Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Pokemon Let's Go Eevee. Well, not until it was leaked a couple months beforehand with the logo and the concept. And the disappointment was immense. I think at the time we all were very tired of Kanto pandering. I think that was the all-time high of Kanto pandering backlash, I think, because before that I think the fan base was very into it, even with X and Y. I think that was maybe the selling point of those games for many people, was like, oh wow, they're pandering back to their roots. But now that had kind of reached an all-time high, I think people were just tired of it, and the Sun and Moon had a lot of callbacks, and so people just didn't really want another visit to Kanto. They wanted something new, they wanted something fresh. And this was not only just a Kanto remake, but it was also a Pokemon Go console game, really. It was an adaptation of a mobile game and mixing it in with the Kanto remake. It was very odd, it was very weird, and it was a very weird decision. However, I think it does kind of make sense. I mean, Pokemon Go to this day, even almost 10 years later, is still an absolutely gigantic entity. And I think that using the Switch's mechanics, using the motion control for a Pokemon game is actually a very smart way of starting a console. As before you couldn't have that kind of thing, as it was all on a handheld console. However, now you have a full console, and so instead of just jumping straight into a brand new generation, they decided to experiment with it. Go for a different game, a very different style of Pokemon game. And personally, I did quite enjoy Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. They're not exactly the best Pokemon games, and I don't know if they were entirely necessary. However, I think that a lot of the hatred for those games comes from the disappointment and I guess the expectation that Pokemon would go bigger for its first entry, and instead we had a very, very traditional Pokemon game at the start of this Nintendo Switch era. However, Pokemon Gen 8 still loomed over the fan base and definitely kept the excitement going, and this was really a way of tiding us over for the real big event. Now 2019 obviously was all about Pokemon Sword and Shield, Pokemon Generation 8. The excitement leading to that reveal on Pokemon Day was very, very palpable, and I was very, very excited, I remember. And we could even have an entire video just going on the entire hype cycle of Sword and Shield, the ups and downs of it. And obviously, initially there was excitement, also kind of pushback on how maybe samey and generic it looked in terms of continuing from just being like a HD 3DS game in many ways. And then you had Dexit, obviously, just the most controversial thing of the Pokemon Switch era. Well, that's debatable, but it's up there, and I think all this stuff kind of clouds this game with an aura of kind of maybe disappointment. When it came out, there was a lot of praise for it, and I still stand by it. I still love Sword and Shield as games, but there are a lot of issues with it. I mean, for one, I think the wild area is a great step in the right direction, and it did show that they were pushing towards what they'd get to later. However, I think that the visuals in the wild area are very indicative of this Nintendo Switch era, when they didn't have control of the camera, and you could there was a big open area. Just the frame rate and like the visuals were just at an all-time low in a way that felt almost unacceptable, and it was really indicative of the kind of level that GameFreak were working at, and how inexperienced they were. Pokemon Sword and Shield's main campaign, and the cities that aren't open and don't have control of the camera, I thought it was a good game. It was a traditional Pokemon game, and the gym challenge itself is maybe the best in the series. Just the scale of it with the Dynamax, the stadiums emulating like football stadiums, as obviously it's based on Britain. I really did enjoy the region, as I am from obviously the UK, and so seeing all these areas, you could kind of tell what they were inspired by. But the towns, they were memorable, but they also lacked a scope. You couldn't really explore them much. You couldn't really go into a lot of different landmarks. I mean, especially after playing Black and White, those towns were very, very active and very, very alive, and you could go into these different places, and there was different mini games and different buildings, different shops. But you go into Wyndon, you see it, you go, oh, that's really cool, and then you move on, you do the main story thing. And speaking of the story, I love the characters, but they just didn't really get much to do, and I feel the actual story was just really vague, and it left for a really, really bad climax that had potential to be interesting, but it's just kind of an underwhelmingly written climax. As you never witness big events. Leon goes and does them for you, and obviously Pokemon always has it where you have, like, for example, N is the main character of Black and White, but at least in those cases your main character is witnessing N do stuff, or fighting N. In that, it's kind of he's the main character, but you're still a fly on the wall. Whereas in Sword and Shield, they specifically make you kind of have you're almost like ignoring the main story while doing the gym challenge. The gym challenge is incredible, and it's Pokemon at the end of the day. But it's just underwhelming route designs, very very lackluster story. The wild area just looked really really bad visually, but I thought it was a really fun game, and I think it showed promise for what Pokemon was kind of heading towards at that point. So there was a lot to be desired in many ways, but I think when I look back on my journey with Pokemon Sword and Shield, it was maybe the last traditional Pokemon game that we got. I think maybe one of the most interesting things of the Switch era has to definitely be the DLC for Pokemon Sword and Shield in 2020. And this DLC model has now been used again for Scarlet and Violet. However, I think that it's important to talk about Sword and Shields as it is the first of its kind, replacing the third version, or the sequel, which had been done before. And I think it was maybe my favourite move of the Switch era, as I feel the DLC by far outweighs the third version. Because I mean, for example, Sword and Shield's DLC. I mean, Isle of Armor was pretty good. It was enjoyable, but Crown Tundra is just absolutely incredible, and it is the highlight of Generation 8 in my opinion. The area is far more interesting to explore. There's even like a seamless town in it, which I think was definitely an indicator of the future. And they introduced brand new legendaries like Regidrago, which is one of my favorite Pokemon of all time. And the Galarian birds are just absolutely incredible. And Calyrex as a legendary they added, he was hated on because of his weird design, but I just think such an incredible character. The story was interesting, the area was interesting, the Pokemon were interesting. I was just really happy with how they handled Sword and Shield, getting a third instead of getting a third version, getting like DLC. And it's a model that I hope they keep up. I think that was definitely one of my favourite aspects of the Switch era. Perhaps the most defining year of Nintendo Switch's Pokemon era has to be 2021, as it showed us the two sides of the series on Switch. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, and the Pokemon Legends Arceus, which had come out early in January 2022. However, it was obviously announced and a lot of information shown in 2021. And it's the dichotomy of Pokemon on Switch. For example, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were a rushed out, outsourced remake of Diamond and Pearl, which were entirely faithful. And so unlike Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which took elements from X and Y and almost acted as a sequel to X and Y, but with Gen 3 obviously still being a remake, but incorporating new ideas into it. Instead, we just had a very boring, a very odd looking. It had like a Link's Awakening inspired look, but it just didn't look very good, and I think it's because it was rushed. However, that was remedied by the fact that we had Pokemon Legends Arceus also announced, and this was a very exciting announcement. I remember just when first seeing that, it was just so exciting. We had the trainer crouch and roll and throw a Pokeball in real time, and you could see like the Pokemon fights look more dynamic, and it was a prequel to Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, and it was just such an interesting, unique take on the series. And while the visuals and the frame rate looked very dubious at the time, I think there was optimism for that, and excitement for that. But I think that the look of Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl certainly muted a lot of that excitement out. Now, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, they are it's a hard game to really evaluate because they are literally just Diamond and Pearl. But maybe that's kind of the issue. Diamond and Pearl, they're like decent games, But the thing is that Platinum is like a better game in every way, and there's absolutely no reason to ever go back to Diamond and Pearl. And for some godforsaken reason, they decided to put no Pokemon Platinum elements into Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. It just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know why they didn't do that. It's just there is no reason why you wouldn't adapt the Platinum. I understand that they wanted to be as faithful as possible, but I think if you're actually listening to your fan base, you know that people find Diamond and Pearl to be quite slow, and it was definitely a big thing at the time when it came out, and it just seemed like it was extremely cheap, and they couldn't even fit in new aspects into the game. It was just a carbon copy of Diamond and Pearl, and so it's just very uninspired and safe and very cheap. Pokemon Legends Arceus, on the other hand, is maybe the most exciting and most indicative of the future of Pokemon. Especially now we're getting into another Pokemon Legends game hype cycle, because this game is just exactly what Pokemon should be. It is just a extremely fun game. It's quite simple actually. All things considered, it is taking the formula of Pokemon and it is changing it up, and it is creating itself a new formula. A formula based on catching and being a Pokemon trainer, kind of bonding with your Pokemon. It's all about you being sent to the past by Arceus, and everyone's scared of Pokemon, and you're creating the first Pokedex, and you're introducing Pokemon to people in a way that they hadn't been acquainted with the Pokemon in the way that they are in the modern day, and they're all scared of them, and so you have to like almost convince them that Pokemon are your friends. And so each time you catch the Pokemon, with your real like your actual aim, you're actually throwing it in the overworld. You get like different entries for like different ways of catching it. Like how many you catch 10 of them, you get like a mark for it. And so that's how it becomes addictive like that. You even have like alpha Pokemon in the overworld that are just like these bigger, kind of stronger ones that you want to catch. And if you do catch them, you have like just a bit of a bigger version of that Pokemon. And it's just like, and the main story itself is also quite simple, but you have like full action boss fights where you as a trainer are taking on the bosses. You're doing rolls, you're throwing these sacks at it, and you are vulnerable as a trainer. You can die, like you can actually die. Instead of just being when your Pokemon pass out, it's about you. When you pass out, it doesn't matter if all your Pokemon are still alive, you will die. And it feels like a very bold take and a very very clear step towards the future. It's a very future thinking Pokemon game. And I feel like Pokemon Legends Arceus is ultimately a definition of Pokemon on Switch. It is an experimental push forward for Pokemon, and it was our first glimpse at Pokemon on a main home console. So by this point, I think that the Switch era was relatively lukewarm in a lot of people's minds. People liked the way that it was handled on Switch. They didn't think that it was as good as it could be, but they didn't think it was terrible. There wasn't as much dooming. Not until Scarlet and Violet finally got announced and released in a unacceptable state. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Scarlet and Violet were released in a abysmal state. They were buggy, they ran like shit, they looked really bad visually. But Scarlet and Violet, I think, also were a huge step in the right direction, but also a huge blunder that needed to happen. I say this because I think that the mistake of releasing Scarlet and Violet in the state that they were, and the feedback that the fans gave this game, the harsh feedback that the fans gave this game, is really going to inform the way that GameFreak and the Pokemon Company handle not only the series in terms of the innovation and the way that the actual games are made, but also in terms of how much time these games are given, and how much leverage Game Freak actually get given to actually cook with these games. But looking at Scarlet and Violet on its own as a video game and not just as a, I guess, a lesson to be learned, I think these games are also quite mixed. I mean, personally, Scarlet and Violet are some of my top Pokemon games, and it's mainly because I really did enjoy the open world structure. I mean, this is the first properly open world Pokemon game, and it really does deliver on that. It feels truly open world, and it was just really fun, and it felt quite immersive. I mean, even with just really uninspired and bland visuals, you still get invested in exploring the areas. But, at the same time, I really do hope that they fix the level scaling in the next open world Pokemon game and make it that when you're, if you want to do the last gym first, that you don't have to worry about levels, because that's one of the big issues I think with the open world structure is that it's fundamentally broken because you can't do anything in any order, because if you do something in the wrong order, you get punished for it. And if it was an action game, if it was a real-time action game, I think it'd be more forgivable. But since it's turn-based, it is ultimately an impossible feat to do it in any order, really. And in addition, because of the seamless open world facade they wanted to make sure that we felt, Metagoza is the only place that is a loaded in area, and it is noticeably the best city in the game. It's not, the best city in Pokemon, but it feels more like it feels the most like an actual city, and that's because it gets a chance to be loaded in its own place. Whereas if you go into any of the other cities, they lack a sense of scale. They lack anything to do, really. They're just very forgettable and they run like shit. So it's just, I think Pokemon should be less afraid to because if they can't match the scale of Breath of the Wild, I don't think they need to be that. They don't need to be seamless in that open world. They I think they have leverage to have these loaded in areas, because I think people would rather have memorable and tangible cities that are memorable to them than having, very unforgettable and, really poorly looking towns that suffer as a result of being seamless in the open world. But Scarlet and Violet, they're not all bad. I mean, uh, I love the story of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. The story and the characters are just some of the best in the series, and the Area Zero aspect of the game is incredible, and it's absolutely the best part of it. It's just one of the best. It's the first time that Pokemon has actually felt like it had a party, like a human party. Like you go down with your friends, and it feels like a JRPG moment. And I think that's something that they should definitely continue to invest in. Building these stories around characters, because I think that is, the most impactful part of Pokemon as a series. But I think that in the future they need to scale back a little bit, work within their own confines. And because the thing is, Paldea is just not very memorable as a region. It's fun to explore, but because of the fact that it's open world, it just loses a lot of identity that Pokemon regions have. But I think that Scarlet and Violet are an important lesson, because these games, they blundered in a way that no Pokemon game before it had, and it forced Game Freak and it forced the Pokemon Company to wake up and realize that the scale that they're trying to go for, it just isn't within the wheelhouse of their deadlines, and it just isn't in the wheelhouse of their own personal scope. And so I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic for Gen 10, because I think that it is a real turning point for the series, as they are going to avoid facing this exact scenario again. And so I hope that they take in the harsh feedback, they take it to heart, and they actually build on this and keep going, because I think that Scarlet and Violet is a sign of actual change. It's a sign of innovation. It's a sign of adapting to a home console, And Pokemon Legends as a sub-series is also another thing. That is another thing that is showing that they are willingly adapting to a home console. As it's very different take on Pokemon. And in Pokemon Legends ZA is going to be set entirely in a city. That is just really different and out there. And so ultimately, going into the Nintendo Switch 2, I'm optimistic about Pokemon on that, because I think Game Freak actually do want to experiment with the series, and I think that the Switch era was rough, but it was ultimately a place for them to really, really experiment and put out their ideas. And they failed in many ways and they succeeded in many ways, but ultimately, in the end, it will lead to great games, in my opinion. And so I think that the Nintendo Switch era of Pokemon, while divisive, was crucial to Pokemon as a series. And so many people think that Pokemon is in a dire situation, and maybe it is. You'd be fair to think so, but I ultimately think that this was really a testing ground for something greater. And maybe it's a little bit too optimistic to excuse them using an entire console generation as a testing ground, and releasing kind of poorly performing games often. But it will be worth it in the end, and I believe people will respect that in the future after the Switch 2 games come out and hopefully look better and run better and feel more cohesive. Anyway, that is it for this video. I'm very, very excited to see more Pokemon Legends ZA finally. I'm very optimistic about this game. I think it's gonna be great, and I think that Pokemon as a whole is ultimately going in the right direction. It's going in the right direction despite a very rocky path to that direction. And Pokemon Legends ZA is ultimately the light at the end of that tunnel. And I think maybe I'll be making a video in 10 years going over how the Switch 2 was a renaissance for Pokemon. So let's hope. But if you disagree, then give me a reply. Tell me what you think. So yeah, I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.